Thinking about displacement is more than just thinking about moving when the island is gone. It is about thinking about moving when you can no longer grow crops, when your water has salt in it, when you can no longer take your kids from your village to their school.
So we had the biggest recorded cyclone ever. We had 40-metre waves that wiped out the infrastructure all along the western coast of our island. So that included our courts, our only museum, our hospitals, lots and lots of houses and homes.
We experience the impacts almost every day in our lives. We experience extreme events like tropical cyclones, flooding, drought, as well as those slow onset events like sea level rise.
The sequence of catching the fish are also affected greatly because of the frequency of the high tides.
But what we're experiencing now is that because of sea level rise, we're having to think about moving our burial grounds. And so just not an uneasy feeling to think about having to move them.
Above all, climate change is a matter of human rights. It goes to absolutely fundamental issues of the right to life, the right to dignity, the right to survive. And climate displacement raises a host of new legal issues.
With tens of thousands of islands, many of which rise only a few meters above sea level, the Pacific is on the front line of the effects of climate change. In the Western Pacific, sea level has risen faster than anywhere else in the world, and the coasts of these islands could retreat by more than 40 meters by 2050. For some of the region's inhabitants, 50,000 of whom are at risk of losing their homes each year, leaving their land, which has become uninhabitable, is now a reality. Yet these people have no special legal status. How can their fundamental rights be guaranteed? How can we prevent cultures and identities from disappearing forever? These legal questions require urgent answers. They involve understanding these issues, investigating key concepts, and adapting existing law. In Oceania, many island states and territories are already experiencing the full impact of climate change. Among them are Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands. Within these specific states and territories, some island groups are more exposed than others. This is the case of many low-lying islands in French Polynesia, the Loyalty Islands in New Caledonia, or the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea. The inhabitants of the Carterets, who were forced to leave their land because of rising water levels, were considered to be the first climate-displaced persons.
My name is Ursula. I was born on the Carterets. My family has lived there for many generations. Now I live in Boka, on mainland Bougainville. I set up an organization to help my people relocate. It's called Tulele Pesa. I'm visiting the Carteret Islands to talk to my people about the relocation. Can I swim? There are 6 islands in this group. My island is Huene. It's small. Only 20 people live on this island. This is my home. In the Carteret's land is traditionally owned by women. My grandmother would pass land to my mother to me, to my daughter. I own Huene, and 10 years along the line, I would love to pass on this island to my daughter, but I will not be able to do that.
When the authorities failed to provide the hoped-for aid quickly enough, Ursula Rakova organized the relocation of her community to safer land, granted by the local church 80 kilometers from the Carterets.
Okay, so this is the Tilputs Primary School. We're hoping to support the school by building 4 classrooms, 2 teachers' houses, 1 student hall and library. And this will cater for children who will be coming from Carteret into the school. We have managed to secure 81 hectares in Tilputs for 5 families to come in and resettle. So the homes will be established over on that side.
Once individuals or communities leave, the concerns about landlessness, about homelessness, food insecurity, access to healthcare, all of these critical elements of one's livelihood are up in the air. Once you enter a new community or country, there are additional concerns with respect to, again, accessing services, if you have any chronic health problems or acute health problems, if you need education for your children, access to land and property.
Right to property, right to education, right to health. Many legal issues are at stake for those who are forced to leave their home village, even if they remain within their state. The issues are all the more complex because in many parts of Oceania, the entire social structure, including family names and the rights they confer, are linked to the land of origin.
And so in Samoa and in many islands in the Pacific, we have a chiefly system. And so each village has a chief or the matai, the person who makes the decisions in the family and who leads the family and leads the village. And so, for instance, in Samoa, we have different matais, different chiefs that belong to each village. And so when you're thinking about relocation, if you take one village and put them in with another, then who becomes the chief? What chiefly titles do we lose? Because we have a lot of our whaalupenga or of our, how do you say, like ancestry, our family ties and connections are within our chiefly title names. And so when we lose that, we lose the connection to where we came from. And so there's so much more to think about when moving. There's places in Melanesia that have different dialects according to their village. And so when one culture moves or one village moves to another village, whose dialect do they use? Do they have to let go of that dialect? Do they have to start learning a new language? And that's just moving within the island itself. It's not even talking about moving off island.
Alors c'est vrai que ces phénomènes climatiques induisent nécessairement un déplacement, une relocalisation de ces personnes qui restent en bord de mer. Et ce qui peut paraître aussi un peu compliqué puisque la grande majorité des gens qui habitent sur les îles Loyauté en Nouvelle-Calédonie sont des personnes de droit coutumier, donc sur des terres coutumières. Le Kanak, il est rattaché à sa terre. Il y a une conception Kanak qui veut que la terre n'appartient pas à la personne, mais c'est la personne qui appartient à la terre. Donc le Kanak n'est là en tant que fait un rôle d'attendance, il surveille la terre pour transmettre à une génération future. Donc finalement, si on déplace ces personnes-là qui ont un lien particulier à la terre, ça pose des questions. Parce qu'ils vont arriver dans un nouvel endroit, avec des nouvelles personnes, peut-être des nouvelles façons de vivre, de voir les choses aussi. Finalement, ça pose beaucoup de questions. Ça fera rentrer à la fois le droit coutumier, surtout le droit coutumier, parce que l'IFU, c'est sur terre coutumière. Et ça peut susciter aussi quelques conflits.
It is well established that people are impacted differently by relocations on a variety of intersecting issues due to their geographical location, their economic status, their education, their age, and of course, their gender identity. For instance, women have long been the first responders of responding to natural disasters and climate change in the region. And despite women having convened informally and being first responders, their voices remain silent or absent within final decision-making processes.
Climate change is not just about statistics. Climate change is not just about science. Climate change is about human rights and the vulnerability of these people who live in those smaller atolls in the Pacific. Where is human rights when it comes to them being displaced from their communities to another location, not of their choice, but they have to move because they are being affected and they are being forced to leave. We know that we are not alone in this fight on climate change. I met people from Kiribati, I met people from Tuvalu and the Marshall Islands who are also experiencing rising sea levels.
Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and Tokelau are called atoll nations. They are entirely made up of atolls, that is to say, low-lying coral islands, rising just a few meters above sea level, with no high points to take refuge in, unlike Hawaii, for example.
One of my first experiences on an atoll, which is like a coral island that's very narrow, is that you walk along the shoreline and you have the shoreline, but then you turn 180 degrees and there's a shoreline behind you. And so you are literally surrounded by water. And so my understanding of vulnerability, I couldn't understand it until I actually set foot on these places. My main discovery was water and how important it is for these communities, and how they live with it in their everyday, whether it's their front yard and backyard and how they play. It's how they get sustenance, and being so close is really helpful. Actually, they just literally go 10 feet and they have what they need. The idea that countries are polluting carbon emissions to turn that water into a threat for these communities there's so much injustice in that.
With no internal displacement possible, the climate crisis could push the entire population of these states to relocate to other countries. This extreme scenario raises many questions, such as the continuity of statehood in case of displacement of their population, the citizenship of these displaced persons, or in the event that the territories become entirely submerged, the preservation of state rights over the maritime zones.
La question se pose du maintien des eaux territoriales, du maintien de la zone économique exclusive, du maintien des droits souverains sur les ressources de la colonne d'eau, donc les thons, le poisson et surtout du sol et du sous-sol de la mer, donc les ressources minérales très riches. La question se pose aussi si une île existe mais n'est plus habitable, donc la population doit se déplacer. Est-ce qu'on peut être, quand on est accueilli chez quelqu'un d'autre, un État en exil?
In 2010, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands contacted me and said, some decade we're going to be underwater. And that raises a whole host of novel legal issues. If we're underwater, are we still a state? Do we still have a seat at the United Nations? What is the citizenship of our displaced people who will take us in? Do we have any legal rights against the people who did this to us? So he asked me to look into those issues. It is not expected that through the end of the century, any countries will be completely underwater, but some of them might become uninhabitable because the sea levels have become so dangerous, and if that happens, there could be a threat to sovereignty. No state has ever ceased to exist physically. States have ceased to exist because of military action or other political steps. But no state has ever ceased to exist physically. And so this raises entirely novel legal questions about sovereignty and the continuation of statehood. The people who are displaced by that state may continue to have some kind of legal existence as a quasi-state, even in a location different from their home territory. And there would then be a lot of vague legal issues about what their rights are, whether they have political and economic rights.
A legal existence that would be preserved even in the event of forced displacement of the population. This is also the wish of the former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong.
And what I'd like to see my grandchildren be able to do is wherever they go, wherever they are, they will always have this place to come to. There may be somewhere else, but they need to know that this was the land of my grandfather, okay? And his grandfather and mother. Because, you know, to lose sight, to lose that would constitute a certain loss of identity. You know, home is home. There is nothing like home. It's special. We have people who have gone, lived abroad, but they've come back.
I came to New Zealand almost 30 years ago, and I returned to Tuvalu more recently in 2019. There are so many obvious changes. So many things have been damaged by the sea. That is why my hope and dream is for those of you who have the power to make a change. Please look at my people. Look at my people with love. We just don't have the land to handle these climate change events. There is nowhere we can hold on to. We have no mountains. That is my dream.
Famanatu Iosefa is permanently settled in New Zealand with her children. Her story is also about the challenge of living one's identity, culture, and references. That is to say, enjoying one's cultural rights when one is far from his or her homeland.
When I came to New Zealand, I came with mats of pandanus leaves in my suitcase. These are purely Tuvaluan traditions, and we use them to show our love to our children. I came to New Zealand with Tuvaluan traditions and customs, including those of the Tuvaluan Congregational Church. Another tradition that I'm wearing right now is the tau, also made of pandanus leaves. In Nuku'ulai'lai, you can distinguish them because they have tiale flowers. Now that I live in New Zealand, many Tuvaluans know that I have many grandchildren. They would recognize them because they carry on our tradition of dancing, Pa'atele. You may especially recognize them because of their performance on New Zealand national TV. Their group is called Manene Dance Group.
It's so hard to think about how culture can survive past having no land to survive on. For Samoan culture, a lot of it, if not most of it, is rooted in the land. And so our language comes from words that are connected to land. Siva Samoa, which is our traditional dance, is movements that mimic the way the land moves. Our food comes straight from what we have been able to do with the resources we have on the land. And so thinking about how our culture can survive if we were to move, I can't even imagine that, because then you even have to put into account the factors in the new place we move to, right? Assimilation is such a struggle for a lot of Pacific Islanders, when it's a fact that when parents move from the islands to New Zealand, they teach their kids English because they want to make it easier for them to have a life here. And so I don't know what our language would look like if we didn't have an island to root it on. And I don't know what that culture would be able to look like past that type of future.
C'est pas seulement la relocalisation, mais c'est aussi, par exemple, sur le mode de fonctionnement des gens sur les îles. Parce que le monde, par exemple, un exemple, le monde occidental, c'est le temps, c'est linéaire. Chez les Kanaks, c'est cyclique, c'est-à-dire c'est basé sur le cycle de l'igname. Le dérèglement climatique vient dérégler aussi ces modes de vie-là. Donc finalement, ce n'est pas que sur la relocalisation des personnes, mais c'est aussi sur le mode de fonctionnement et la vision des choses, la vision des Kanaks sur leur monde.
Des États comme Fidji, par exemple, depuis 2014, ont travaillé activement sur le déplacement d'un certain nombre de villages pour tenir compte des effets du changement climatique. La CPS y a contribué pour travailler avec le gouvernement fidjien et les populations concernées sur ce que ça voulait dire de quitter un lieu qui était leur lieu de culture, de vie, d'identité, et d'aller sur un autre lieu. Comment préserver son identité culturelle alors que ce groupe est accueilli par un autre groupe culturel avec d'autres repères, avec d'autres légendes, avec d'autres mythes, avec un autre lien à la terre.
Because climate change directly threatens people's fundamental rights, legal tools have a crucial role in this crisis. However, existing legal instruments, drafted at a time when the effects of climate change were not identified, only indirectly address these many challenges.
We have in place a number of instrument treaties, and like the international covenants, one on civil and political rights, the other one on economic, social, and cultural rights. We also have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which certainly contains a number of rights which we would say are customary international law. And it is possible to pinpoint for some of the consequences that climate change has on Pacific nations, pinpoint some of these rights. Certainly the right to life. You could talk about some of the rights that you have under the economic and social and cultural rights. The only problem, I think, is really the imminence of the threat.
I mean, I think what we're seeing with respect to climate-induced migration is an issue that cuts across a number of areas of the law. And because of that, there are a number of people that might address it, but also a number that might suggest that someone else should address it. It cuts across international law, domestic laws, subnational laws, a hybrid of the two. We know that humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law, domestic concerns around national security, property, these are all areas that might own this issue. And of course, the emerging climate law. And we are finding, I think, the absence of a directed space to carry that because there's so many areas that could carry it.
Among the multitude of tools available, there is another text, the Geneva Convention. Drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War and signed in 1951, it is the main international legal instrument dealing with the rights of refugees. But are the criteria defining refugees in this text applicable to people fleeing the consequences of climate change?
Alors la Convention de Genève vient définir ce qu'est un réfugié. Est un réfugié la personne qui craint avec raison d'être persécutée pour un certain nombre de motifs et qui se trouve en dehors de son pays d'origine et qui ne peut pas obtenir la protection de son état d'origine, de son état de nationalité ou de résidence habituelle. Aujourd'hui, on considère généralement qu'il y a en réalité 4 motifs: motif ethnique, motif religieux, motif politique et motif d'appartenance à un certain groupe social. Elle ne concerne pas, elle n'évoque pas les réfugiés climatiques, qui est d'ailleurs en conséquence un terme juridiquement impropre, tout simplement parce qu'elle a été adoptée dans un contexte où cette question ne se posait pas. La question de la révision de la Convention de Genève est une question délicate. Faudrait-il étendre la Convention aux déplacés environnementaux ? La question est délicate parce que cette convention a le grand mérite d'exister depuis 1951 Et par conséquent, toucher à cette convention, c'est aussi prendre le risque d'une renégociation qui pourrait aboutir à des changements dans le sens d'une moindre protection des réfugiés.
I certainly don't think that there is any appetite for a protocol, an amendment to the, or simple amendment to the convention. So what we need to do, I think, is really to look first and foremost with the instruments we have, and probably in some cases maybe indirectly, and then look to the future with some emerging duties or responsibilities. But I would say that in terms of the current instruments, I think it doesn't do justice to refugees or to environmental migrants to be considered under the same umbrella, the refugee status. This is a no-win situation.
Your Royal Highnesses, Your Excellencies, Lords, Ladies and Gentlemen, please take your seats. Bringing voices from Earth into COP26, please welcome climate campaigner Brianna Fruin.
When I was a little girl, I was taught the importance and impact of words.
Migration is the primary human consequence of climate change. It directly affects people's lives, their most fundamental rights, their identity. Why then have we not put this issue at the heart of international negotiations?
And to follow it up with long overdue action. If you're looking for inspiration
Lors de la négociation de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques, qui est le premier traité international qui porte sur cette question du climat, certains États, dans le cadre de la négociation, vont exprimer leurs préoccupations à l'égard du fait que les changements climatiques entraîneront une disparition de leur territoire et donc soulèveront des problématiques en termes de migration humaine. En revanche, même si cette question-là a été abordée dans les négociations, en 1990, lorsqu'on négocie la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques, l'attention des États va essentiellement se porter sur la problématique de la réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Alors cette question des déplacements de population, elle commence à être évoquée dans les négociations sur le climat à partir de 2010, qui est la conférence des Nations Unies sur le climat de Cancun, qu'on appelle également la COP16, la 16e conférence des parties à la Convention. Et à la COP21, il y a un tournant important qui va s'opérer, puisque lors de cette conférence, les États décident de mettre en place un groupe de travail qui va être chargé d'élaborer des recommandations sur cette question des déplacements de population causés par les changements climatiques. Sauf que ce sont des recommandations qui font simplement inviter les États à étudier la possibilité d'intégrer dans leurs lois et leurs politiques cette question des migrations climatiques.
Paris resulted from 10 years of negotiations, of climate negotiations, and the fundamental task of those 10 years was to institute a new climate regime which would last for decades and would be substituting for or taking over from the Kyoto Protocol, which was not adequate to deal with the problem of climate change. So in 10 years, Paris has achieved, I think it has achieved a new regime. What we try to do is to keep the global temperature increase above pre-industrial levels to well below 2 degrees, even towards 1.5 degrees. Second important theme is adaptation, which is how countries adapt and react to the effects of climate change, which they can't avoid. And then the third component very important for developing countries, poor, vulnerable countries, and Pacific countries is finance, which means the means by which countries can help those countries adapt to the effects of climate change and also to make the transition to low carbon. I have to say that in all this negotiation, the role or the place given to questions of migration, climate refugees, etc., has been rather limited and even peripheral. I think understandably when you see the magnitude and the political difficulty of that task of as I said, creating effectively a new or a more developed climate regime, a more resilient climate regime internationally.
Parler du problème des migrations climatiques dans ce forum de négociation amènera nécessairement à parler de la question de la responsabilité des États dans les causes de ces migrations-là, qui sont les changements climatiques. Et on sait très bien que discuter de la responsabilité des États dans l'origine du problème des changements climatiques, c'est une question qui est extrêmement controversée dans les négociations sur le climat, et que donc ce problème de responsabilité historique dans l'origine du climat pourrait devenir un facteur bloquant dans l'avancement des discussions sur les migrations climatiques.
In this context, judicial interpretation, as in the meaning that judges or experts from certain committees give to the applicable legal provisions, plays a decisive role in adapting existing law to these new challenges. The Tetiata decision, issued on October 24, 2019, by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, has become emblematic of this evolution and marked a turning point.
Over the last decade or so, in fact, perhaps even longer now, there have been a number of cases brought before Australian and New Zealand decision makers by people claiming that they shouldn't be sent back to Pacific Island countries because of the impacts of disasters and climate change. There was a case taken there against New Zealand by Mr. Tesiota from Kiribati.
In the Tesiota case, Mr. Tesiota applied for refugee status in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And his application was unsuccessful, and he appealed that decision to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Tribunal. He was unsuccessful there, and so he appealed to the New Zealand High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the New Zealand Supreme Court. And at each turn, he was unsuccessful. And so then he appealed the decision to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, on the basis that his deportation to Kiribati would breach his right to life that is protected under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. He was ultimately, I guess, unsuccessful in that although the Human Rights Committee recognized that climate change does impact on the right to life, and that's why that comment or the opinion of the committee was really important. It was the first time, or one of the first times, it acknowledged the interrelationship between climate change and the right to life. But there are some limits to the committee's findings, because the committee went back and looked at what was happening in Kiribati and said, although yes, there were implications for Mr. Tesiota's right to life, but they said that in Mr. Tesiota's case, that threat wasn't imminent.
A historic decision in which Hélène Tigdruja participated as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee.
Jusqu'à présent, le Comité des droits de l'homme n'avait pratiquement pas traité de questions liées à ce qui n'entre pas strictement dans son mandat, c'est-à-dire de questions liées à un droit environnemental. En 2018, le Comité avait adopté un document qu'on appelle une observation générale. Donc c'est comme un avis consultatif, c'est un document dans lequel le comité livre son interprétation d'une disposition du pacte. Et dans cette observation générale numéro 36, le comité livrait son interprétation du droit à la vie et il avait réservé, mais dans des termes très généraux, il avait réservé l'idée que l'État a des obligations au titre du droit à la vie lorsque pèsent sur sa population des menaces liées à l'environnement. Et donc, le comité n'avait pas développé davantage ces menaces liées à l'environnement. La décision Tetiota rendue l'année suivante a cette importance de préciser quelles sont les obligations des États en cas d'éloignement du territoire lorsque justement pèse sur la personne qui va être éloignée une menace liée au changement climatique. Les insuffisances de la décision, et je crois qu'il ne faut pas les taire, ça n'est qu'une première décision, et ça n'est qu'une première décision qui ouvre, je l'espère, la voie à la jurisprudence internationale et à l'évolution de la jurisprudence internationale sur cette question. Les insuffisances me semblent, j'irais peut-être de deux ordres. La première insuffisance, évidemment, est liée au test que le Comité des droits de l'homme applique. C'est-à-dire que pour empêcher une expulsion, le degré de risque qu'il faut démontrer est un degré extrêmement élevé. Donc ça, c'est la première insuffisance. La deuxième insuffisance, mais évidemment, ça c'est quelque chose qui va être amené à évoluer plus dans la pratique du comité, plus il recevra ce type d'affaires liées au changement climatique, à l'environnement, et plus sa méthodologie s'affinera. Mais la deuxième insuffisance est peut-être liée au fait que le comité des droits de l'homme, pour l'instant, n'a pas une connaissance suffisamment fine ou suffisamment précise de ce que peuvent être les difficultés de personnes qui sont confrontées au changement climatique et en conséquence quelles devraient être les obligations des États de lutter contre le changement climatique, y compris en négociant, y compris en discutant avec les autres États.
The evolution of the Human Rights Committee's jurisprudence reveals that existing law can be adapted. It is also an illustration of a new awareness, the urgent need for all actors to cooperate in preparing for these human movements. This involves, among other things, the identification of recommendations and good practices. Such non-binding measures are far from perfect, but they nevertheless have the merit of contributing to better anticipation of climate displacement.
I think when we're talking about law, I see very little prospect that this will be dealt with by what we call hard law, a top-down agreement, a top-down legally binding agreement with obligations flowing through to individual countries from that agreement, or a new convention. That would be an almost insuperable task to negotiate. But what I do see coming out of or alongside the negotiations, and perhaps through some of the mechanisms and institutions that have been created, is a much greater awareness of climate-induced migration, or whatever one wants to call it, and maybe countries becoming more ready to include that element in, for example, their bilateral relations, for New Zealand's and other countries' bilateral relations, aid programs in the Pacific, readiness to see the climate element, the climate displacement element, as one factor in taking decisions on migration. So possibly in the area of, if you like, soft law, but just generally, I think doing more analysis, awareness raising on that issue is now well possible, thanks to having a good, resilient international regime put in place.
New Zealand has a connection to the Pacific that starts in terms of colonial outreach at the end of the 19th century. But that it's from after the First World War that the connections with some of these countries really expanded. The expansion deepened in terms of immigration from the 1950s onwards, when New Zealand needed the labour from these places. And so it's a pragmatic relationship, and it's one with not a great start in the imperial section. And what you've got today, when people look at the Pacific Island relationship with New Zealand, is a long-standing legacy. And so when someone comes in and says, let's talk about climate, you need to see it in the context of a much larger relationship that goes back over 100 years. New Zealand has a moral responsibility to help the Pacific. And we've got the Pacific Reset Project that came out under the last Ardern and coalition government, and whereby we're trying to put much more emphasis on the Pacific and hopefully more humanitarian assistance and aid. And as part of this project, we should be expanding that to look at the ability to help these people more with climate-related disasters. I wouldn't yet go to the point whereby we need to say we need to give them a direct access route to the country, but we need to be much more aware that things are changing, and we need to be facilitating the legal and policy changes so that we can help them when it's necessary, because it will be necessary.
When I began my research on climate change and displacement back in 2007, it was quite a novel topic, and I don't think that a lot of governments or policymakers were really paying a lot of attention to it at all. But we've certainly seen things move on in leaps and bounds since that time. And some of the most important initiatives that have been developed have been the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement. The Nansen Initiative was an intergovernmental initiative that was conceived of by Norway and Switzerland. It began in 2012 and it ran for 3 years. Despite being an intergovernmental initiative, it really sought to involve affected communities, experts, international organisations, civil society groups, faith-based groups, a range of stakeholders across the world through a series of regional and sub-regional consultations. And the information that was gathered in that process resulted in what's known as the Agenda for Protection, which essentially sets out a toolkit for governments in terms of how they need to act to address this issue. 109 governments endorsed this roadmap for action, and I think it's really important to recognise that. Essentially, the toolkit response says we need to be looking at a whole host of areas from mitigation to adaptation to disaster risk reduction to finding protection for people who are displaced, whether internally or across international borders, and for finding or creating pathways for migration and mobility.
The Nansen Initiative has now become the Platform on Disaster Displacement. This initiative has recently contributed to the development of concrete recommendations for addressing climate displacement in Fiji in the form of relocation processes that respect human rights, including those of the most vulnerable. The plan also includes a specific fund to support resettlement. Addressing human movement within the law is complex, but not impossible. In the Pacific region, the diversity of links between different territories allows for multiple international migration options, although displacement is always a measure of last resort.
The other big challenge or consideration is some countries in the region are able to move easier than others. I think many of the northern states have a compact arrangement with the United States. For example, Niueans and Cook Islanders have New Zealand passports. So there's an alternative. If you migrate, you have an option at least to be welcomed into another country, New Zealand, and you're provided the support systems that citizens of that country would have. So they too have a level of security as an alternative to move to another country and have been provided some level of support as a citizen or a welcomed migrant. But many of the countries in the region don't have that same level of security. But fundamentally, no islander wants to have to leave their place of birth and their inherent birthrights of their children because we are all culturally very, very much tied to that land. I think the best that we can do to help countries is to get the facts right, not to overinflate issues that we don't know yet, but to provide as much of the certain information that we have to governments and communities so they can make informed decisions, so they can discuss the options that are most suitable for their particular people, their particular culture, and their partners.
La migration n'est pas une manière de préserver les droits. Préserver les droits des migrants est en fait un constat d'échec parce qu'on n'a pas permis à ces personnes de pouvoir vivre bien et de manière épanouie chez eux. Faute d'atténuation, faute d'adaptation suffisante, et donc faute, en somme, d'inaction de la part de tous ceux qui contribuent pour 99,9% aux effets subis par les pays de la zone. Et c'est ce que l'on voit dans énormément de contentieux du changement climatique en ce moment. Le contentieux porté actuellement contre l'Australie par les habitants des îles du détroit de Torres, par exemple, est basé sur le fait que le gouvernement australien doit investir dans l'adaptation dans ces îles pour permettre aux populations de ne pas être obligées de partir, parce que partir veut dire perdre ce lien à la terre et à l'environnement qui est un élément essentiel de la plupart des identités des peuples du Pacifique.
We, the people of the Pacific,
affirm a common wish to live together in peace and harmony.
Displace no other people.
We who remain wish no other home than this.
Now we are engaged in a great climate war.
We call on the leaders of the Pacific Island Forum
to take climate change and human rights
to the International Court of Justice.
Efforts to anticipate human movement must therefore be coupled with actions to enable islanders to remain on their land in the first place and to ensure that states recognize their duties in this regard. This is what motivates young Oceanian leaders to fight for their rights, such as the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change Group, which hopes to see the International Court of Justice issue an opinion on climate change and human rights. It is also what drives the group of climate warriors determined to protect their islands.
So I'm a part of a group called Pacific Climate Warriors, and our slogan or motto is "We are not drowning, we are fighting." And so we're a collection of different types of people from 15 different islands in the Pacific, as well as groups within the Pacific diaspora. So Pacific Islanders living overseas in New Zealand, Australia, and in America. And so among us are educators, activists, environmentalists, artists. So we're really just a wide range of people. And the thing that brings us together is the belief in fighting for our islands. And so our work varies from activism to awareness to adaptation and mitigation projects within the islands and outside. And yeah, we really do believe that there is Pacific resilience.
On a aussi la particularité dans la région de contribuer pour moins de 1% aux émissions globales de gaz à effet de serre et donc d'être parmi ceux qui subissent de plein fouet les mauvais comportements d'autres pays, d'autres groupes industriels, en fait, qui continuent à mettre en œuvre un modèle de développement qui n'est pas compatible, par exemple, avec les objectifs de l'accord de Paris, pas compatible avec la transition écologique ou des objectifs de zéro carbone d'ici 2050. Et avec tout ça, les îles du Pacifique doivent s'adapter beaucoup plus rapidement que d'autres parties du monde. Et cette adaptation, en fait, c'est la survie qui est en jeu. Parce que quand on s'adapte aux effets du changement climatique, ça veut dire qu'on essaie de s'adapter pour rester sur place. Mais cette adaptation doit être accompagnée ailleurs dans le monde par un effort massif d'atténuation qui permettra justement de pérenniser les effets bénéfiques de ces efforts d'adaptation dans les îles.
I tell my students that dealing with the issues of climate change are the issue of their generation. There are so many important tasks ahead, both in terms of moving away from fossil fuels and decarbonizing the economy, to coping with the many kinds of problems that are going to be caused domestically and internationally. And there is no more important work.
The people of the Pacific have been among the first to experience the impacts of climate change. But the threat is global. The entire Indo-Pacific region is directly impacted by its effects, and the consequences for maintaining security and peace in the region. The law must adapt to the challenges of this century in order to serve humans and the environment. The imagination of lawyers, while it cannot do everything, needs to be mobilized more than ever in this collective effort.
You all have the power here today to be better, to remember that in your meeting rooms and drafting documents are more than just black and white objects, to remember that in your words you wield the weapons that can save us or sell us out.
Na hakatawe mo